This is a project that I've been involved in now for some 15 years. We have this little church locked away, and for all the world it looks as if it's a bit of a ruin, but in actual fact it's a fully functioning church which draws a membership of 20 or 30 people from time to time. We meet once a month, and it's a little section of the Unitarian Church of South Australia, which has its premises on Millionaires Row at Osmond Terrace. We work on 7 principles. I won't go into those, but one of the principles is in fact very strongly focused on the environment. And so this was a project that was very dear to our hearts. We had a property that hadn't seen a bushfire ever, not in at least for as long as at least Europeans have lived in the hills. It's an area that's been unburnt for 164 plus years, and probably well before that. So the thought was that if we do a burn, a cool burn, so it didn't get out of control, we would be reducing our fire risk if ever a wildfire came into the area where there would be such intensity of heat that it would destroy our little church and the hostel that is alongside it. So what we did was burn the entire eastern section of our property. And I was interested in documenting the results of that. This is an area where we park cars. To the right of the photo, you can just see a flat area there, adjacent to the cemetery that's attached to this church. All this section has not been burnt, as you can see from the trees. So it provides a sort of a before and after opportunity. This chapel was just beyond the reach of the fire. The fire burnt to the left of the chapel, right down to the western side of our property. Chapel seen from an unburnt section. This is the pathway that leads down to the church from the hostel. The burn was managed by DEW. They were strongly influenced by the principles that Rick Davies espoused, to burn or not to burn. Those principles were put into play with this particular burn. Now you remember Rick Davies' talk on the 22nd of September, 7 principles to guide environmental managers in deciding whether or not to burn ahead of the fire season. The whole aim is to maximise biodiversity. The first principle is that different vegetation types respond differently to fire, and fire response varies according to how frequently an area is burnt. This, of course, has not had a fire for over 164 years. Different plant species are affected differently by fire, and different plants are affected by how hot the fire is. So the idea is to have a burn when the fire is noticeably cooler. It will cause less destruction. And so we chose, given the season that had just passed, the horrific year that we've had with bushfires, we decided to burn soon after the first lot of rains in April. Plant recovery is affected by competition from other native plant species and, of course, introduced weeds. We have a weeding program that keeps those under control all the time. 2 days a week is spent weeding up there. There is also the problem of grazing by feral and native animals, goats, deer, kangaroo, and the effect, of course, also depends on the timing of the burn. So those 7 principles were paramount during this burn. The dominant emergent in our woodland, trees that is, Eucalyptus obliqua, that tree still needs somewhere in the vicinity of 35 to 45 inches a year to grow to its full potential. The flowers of the obliqua. Other trees at Shady Grove, we've got the pink gum, fasciculosa, and we've got the native cherry. These photos were taken soon after our cool burn. Doesn't look too cool there, does it? Some members of the church were not happy with the decision to burn, particularly if they were off the land. Despite many of the obliqua dying and falling as the hills have got hotter and drier, they were dying anyway, even before the fire. But the fire, even the cool burn, gobbled them all up at a faster rate. The timing was important, April after a bit of rain, as I've said. So a lot of the members, church members, panicked and thought we'd destroyed our woodland, we'd never get it back again. Now, of course, after a burn, a charcoal crust forms on the ground, and what you should always do is stay off that crust. You've got to stay right away, because if you break that crust, it will allow the ingress of weeds. And so there was great care taken to keep people off. Of course, the church is well known to walking groups, and they all walk up there basically to have a look at the cemetery, because there are some interesting things there. What we expect will happen is that there will be other trees that are more drought tolerant that will take over in time. But the life of a bleak world with global warming envisaged for the next 30 to 50 years, we're going to see the vegetation drastically changed unless we can get rid of the coal industry 50 years ago. That's the reality of it. We failed to do that, and we've created a hell for ourselves. So something I feel very worried about. Here you can see a tinge of green as the early rains bring new growth. And a section of the short walking trail was laid down after the burn. We put down a trail basically because we knew that people were going to come up and have a look anyway, and it's much easier to say stay on the trail than if we have no trail at all and they can walk anywhere. It's only a 4-acre property, it's not very large, but it's remarkably biodiverse. As always, some trees were left relatively unscathed, probably to their detriment, I think. And let's have a look at some of the after effects. We've seen some of the before effects. So as 2020 unfolded, I made this photographic record. You can see the emergence of leptospermum in spring. You've got lavender grevillea or Grevillea lavandulacea there. I photographed that in October. You've got Divisia leptophylla. Pea flowers are yellow and deep burgundy, typical of the Divisia species, and you'll notice that the leaves look like acacias. And here you can see the profuse rebounding of native grasses after the burn. That was a photograph that was taken in October, and you can just see how all those native grasses have come on. Off to the right there are a whole field of 100 or so hair orchids that we have never seen there for quite some time. So I can't leave the path to prove it, but the native grasses are so prolific, you can just barely see them poking through. If you want to have a look at a field of hair orchids, Robert has a lovely picture on the website, so go in and have a look. It would be something like that. That site, of course, is without the native grasses that were competing with the hair orchids here. Milkmaids were in great abundance in October as the spring got underway. And you can see milkmaids, they were successful enough and high enough to peek over the top of the native grasses that are still growing there. This is a photograph of mine of the Newtons, nodding politely, perhaps even deferentially, to a Platylobium obtuse angulum off to the right. Why you'd want to nod to anything with a name like as obtuse as that, I don't know. So that's a close-up of the Platylobium obtuse angulum. You can see that the angles of the leaves are obtuse, one there, one there, one there, one there, of course, okay? So 3 obtuse angles, which of course geometrically gives you the opportunity of 3 sharp points, 3 acute angles, and that's the whole point because it provides protection for the plant. And here are some more orchids that we found at Shady Grove after the cool burn. You'll be familiar with most of those. So we've had Newtons, the nodding orchid. We had literally hundreds of nanas. We've had the Pardina, the Corymbosa, the Orientis, of course, and so on. And of course, you've got the Cuculatus, the Parsons bands. And maroon hoods too were in great abundance. There's a photograph that I took of the Orientis. missing from the last slide, so I've added it there. That's a current list of the orchids that are found, and we've been able to actually update the species list, of which there are over 70 now on that small property. Gudatus, robusta, sanguinea, and tinifera, the rubra, the mosquito orchid, the gnat orchid, the green hood, banded green hood, rabbit's ears, etc., and many thelemitres. These are the first epicormic shoots that came out. I photographed that in October, so it took a long time coming, but there they are. And most of the trees, those that survived and still standing, are sprouting quite well. But of course, their long-term viability is going to be affected by climate change. That's another little section of the trail that we've added to control human movement at a sensitive time. We've got lots of bulbine lilies there. A bit of a misnomer, it's not a lily at all. The signs were interesting. We had to devise a sign system to draw attention to the plants that were there, realising that plants come and go. We needed a flexible system that can be pulled up, signs adjusted, new signs put in to identify new sorts of plants. There are some of the native grasses flourishing after the burn. They're all doing exceedingly well. That's simply signposting a tea tree emerging after the fire. And here, of course, you've got a photograph of a obliqua death and the rebirth coming up in their hundreds. Xanthorrhoea semiplana have done very well. I had worried about them before. There was strong evidence that they were affected by Phytophthora. However, the burn has brought them on nicely, and it would suggest that the Phytophthora isn't there after all. All it needed was a good cool burn. Xanthorrhoea semiplana is the indigenous species to the area. And you can see some new semiplana growing up amongst the burnt obliqua, and some more of our pathway through the property. And here we've got chocolate lilies, which you'll be familiar with. They made an especially prolific appearance this spring. Another section of the fire, which has, I think, there a local species of Lamandra coming up at this point. It's got a bit of growing to do yet. Lots of milkmaids, very prolific there. And another section of the track amongst the dead obliqua within the cool burn area. Not cool enough for some of those trees, of course. And some yuccas here. These are yuccas in the western section of the property, so they weren't subject to the cool burn. So it provided a really good point of comparison there. So there's quite a bit of dieback you can see in those yuccas, and that made me worried to the extent that we had some tests done to see if Phytophthora was in that area. So it just gives you some idea of what the bushland was like before the cool burn there. There are some more pretty milkmaids, not all in a row there, they're all interspersed, they've gone their own way, flourishing amongst the chocolate lilies, fairly typical of the hills this time of the year. More regrowth in the burnt section with a lot of obliqua fallen logs across the path. Compare that with this section, which is another section of unburnt western part of the property. Xanthorrhoea again showing some considerable signs of dieback. Another section of unburnt shady grove land. The flowers are all absent there, you can see. No flowers. Plenty of native grasses and a few weeds that we try to keep control of. We are very cautious that people don't go on the property without cleaning their boots. So we have boot cleaning equipment in the hostel or out on the deck, which is accessible to anybody who visits. And there's a sign on the gate that tells them to clean their boots before they go in. And that's a note about Phytophthora warning people to clean their boots. This is the gate to the cemetery run by the Unitarian Church. There are some well-known people here. Probably the most well-known is John Dowie. He was a very famous sculptor, of course. You'll be familiar with his Three Rivers statue in Victoria Square. And I've got some photos there of some of the other statues that he's done. He died aged 93, so lived to a good old age. Some more of our cemetery. It has the remarkable habit of having running postmen providing a carpet for all the gravestones. So it really is a beautiful place. I'll just go through a ramulosa, the twiggy daisy bush there. So a whole variety of flowers that are making their appearance. So I'll finish there. In true American style, I'll say, that's all, folks.